Hey, Batten! Welcome to Batten Builds Bridges.
We're your hosts,
Meghan Clancy,
Catalina Perez,
and Jasmine Rangel. This is a Batten podcast where we will delve into various issues that current Batten students face and how they relate to our identities and policy areas of interest as future policymakers.
We hope that we can engage the Batten community to have a more honest, in-depth conversation surrounding these important issues.
This is a mini-series on the topic of first-generation students at Batten, featuring pre-Batten students, Batten BAs, and Batten MPPs.
We hope you enjoy learning more about our first-generation community here at Batten.
For our second episode in this series, we interviewed Brian Zuluaga, a fourth-year BA student at Batten.
Hello, my name is Brian Zuluaga. I'm a fourth year in the 2020 BA class.
And how do you identify, Brian? Are you first gen and low income or one or the other?
Yep, I identify as FGLI, first gen and low income.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you for coming here today. And we just want to start an open and honest conversation about our identities and how that informs our experiences in Batten. Can you speak on your experiences so far as a first gen and low income student in the Batten BA program?
Sure. So I guess it starts off with how I got to know about the Batten School and Batten's programs. It wasn't until my second year at UVA where I actually learned that Batten was, a program that I could, eventually major in. So I say that because I think there's sort of I see like a divide, or at that time, I don't think there was as much outreach to students in general. I think especially not FGLI students. So I think especially being in a space like Garrett Hall where I see like the architecture of the space, the high ceilings. Like just today I had a conversation with a first year who was talking about Garrett Hall himself, and he was talking about how intimidating the space can be, and naturally that's he was also first gen low income as well, so it's something that I'm always conscious of, and I think identifying as an FGLI student is something probably that most other FGLI students also think about as well, because the space can be intimidating for some, and I mean I think events like Batten Hours like help a lot because it's very welcoming, and obviously there's food, and it's generally a positive atmosphere, but I think there's always been the factor of belonging in a space where, and sort of realizing space matters a lot, and it's related with your identity. So
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I've actually had the same experiences as well before I even applied to Batten. Going into Garrett Hall was really intimidating, and to know that that's kind of an experience that other first gens have, it makes me feel a little less isolated in that experience. And when the space is filled for Batten Hours with people, I think it's the people that make Batten a lot more welcoming for me as well as a first gen student. So speaking on your application process, I know you touched upon it a little bit. Did you have any either hiccups or barriers that you feel are directly related to being a first gen or low income student in that process?
well, I think there will always be the barrier of having an application fee. The waiver did help. I did apply for the waiver and I got it. But I think as long as the fee is there, it's always going to be a barrier for a student, regardless of if there's a waiver attached. And I also think about the additional tuition that you have to pay to be at the Batten School in comparison to just being in the college. So yeah, those are some of my thoughts that I had during the application process.
And was the application waiver fee, was that something that you were easily aware of, or was that something that you had to seek out that information on your own?
I think I found it through the website. I think it was pretty visible, like through the program description and the application process on the website. It was pretty easy to find.
Awesome. So did they tell you about the differential tuition after you were already accepted, or is that something that you knew as part of the application process?
So from what I remember, I think it was the same tuition as the college, or maybe a little bit higher. But I know that after I came into the Batten School, it was increased. So it wasn't something that I'm aware of that there was going to be an increase in tuition. I think it was like 5,000.
Okay, great. So that sounds like maybe that's something that, if they haven't already mitigated that's an area of opportunity for a little bit more transparency that I think could help more first-gen students make the decision whether to apply for Batten or not. So thank you for sharing that. So we've talked a little bit about barriers, but what are some areas where you feel like Batten is already doing a really good job for first-gen students, either through support or communication or transparency about what we can expect as first-gen students in Batten?
So I think from Batten School, the first person who comes to my head is Professor Paul Martin. He has a class with, I don't think necessarily you have to be FGLI to be in the class, but he has a class on first-gen students, and I think all the students in the class have to come up with projects on how to improve access to programs or spaces for FGLI students. So Professor Martin's first gen himself, so we have had those conversations in the past. I think it was last semester, Catalina and I, he invited us and some other FGLI students just to have lunch and talk about our experiences. So to have that, have a professor who also identifies the same way as you is very reassuring. And yeah, I mean, it's generally it's very welcoming, and it makes, as an FGLI student, it makes me feel supported that he's willing to reach out to students, and because he recognizes his experience when he was a BA as well. So yeah, I've definitely seen it through Professor Martin, and I've also seen admissions been very supportive as well in terms of application waivers and increasing access for all students, especially first gen low income.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well. I met Professor Martin during first gen week of 2018 when I was still thinking about applying to the accelerated program, and they had on first gen day they had a listening session with potential current and some alumni students, and I think just seeing that there was first gen representation in the faculty and administrators at Batten made me feel a little bit more secure in that process. So do you find that you are made aware of your first gen status as an accepted BA in Batten classes every day? Maybe if you can speak to any instances where you feel like your first gen status either has hindered you or been a barrier as a student in Batten.
Yeah, something I often think about is how in the MPP, I believe you have to get an internship, so usually there's funding attached to that, and there's nothing like that in the BA program. So for example, I had accepted an internship this last summer, and it was an unpaid internship. So I had to, negotiate it in a way to get at least minimum wage for that internship. And I think it's definitely a financial barrier for the Batten School, but I think it's also negating the experience of FGLI students and not recognizing that there is a need. And if the success of Batten students in general is in the mission of the Batten School itself, I think it should be a conversation that should be had in funding both BA and MPP students.
Yeah, I think internships is really where I feel my first gen status the most, especially amongst our peers being here at UVA. For instance, in my first couple of weeks here as a transfer student in the College of Arts and Sciences, I'm a politics, government concentration major there. And people that I was sitting next to, one person on the right of me had interned for Tim Kaine's office and got that position through a friend of their mother's, and to the left of me, someone had interned at Google because their father worked there as well. And so I think you spoke a little bit to the financial differential, but I'd be interested to hear if you've had similar experiences as far as social capital goes as a first gen that we just don't have.
Oh, absolutely. I was really conscious about that during my internship this summer in DC, and I was really proactive recognizing that. I try to have as many coffee chats as I could have, because something I often say is that it's either you're born with this network and you're not. And I mean, it takes a lot of guts. It takes a lot of confidence in yourself to reach out to employers or just people you want to have a conversation with. But they also respect you for doing that. So I definitely try to do that this summer, because I mean, I come from a family of immigrants. My parents came from Colombia. So it's not like I already had that social network or social capital to have a quick phone call from my dad to I don't know, some colleague that he has, and to try to secure a job. So I think being FGLI naturally is, I wouldn't say consequences, but it's something you're conscious of in terms of career searches or a professional network.
And I think when we talk about social capital, I think a lot of times, I think that's one of the biggest barriers for first gen, especially in competitive programs and as we're moving into not only internships, but job prospects. But I think you touched on something important, that being first gen is also an asset, because I think we do have to learn how to self-advocate, like you said in your internship. What are some ways that you think Batten could either recognize that in the first gen Batten community, or ways that they could kind of support that and kind of build on those strengths?
So I think there's a lot of opportunities with contacting our alumni base, or just being very open that alumni want to contact students, because I mean, we have a great alumni network, but I don't think there's enough of a communication between current undergrads or MPPs with our alumni base. And the fact is that I think all students have to gain if we did have more of a communication with alumni, but it's even more important for FGLI students, because we're still growing our networks. And again, it's sort of a differential between not having that additional educational experience within your family, and also the factor of your social economic status. I think we need to give more access to all of our students, but especially the ones who can benefit from it the most.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that so much. I want to kind of go back to one of the things that you said has really helped you build that social capital while you're here at Batten, is going to those coffee chats, which is something that as a first gen and an introvert is really intimidating for me, and I'm sure a lot of other first gens have those experiences. Did you always feel comfortable entering those spaces, or is that something you kind of had to build up the courage to do? And if so, how have you done that?
So I learned a lot during these coffee chats. One is that usually they'll get you coffee or buy you breakfast, which is sort of nice. And then two, people love talking about themselves, and I sort of realized that, you can just let them steer the conversation. And as long as I think there's also a difference between genuine networking, whereas you're networking to get a job, and I lean more towards the relationship building and getting to know someone regardless of their job, or I really just wanted to get to know them, and I think everyone has their unique way of facing or going to a coffee chat or trying to broaden your network. But for me personally, now that I'm realizing it as a first gen low-income student, I never really thought about creating a network. Networking is not a phrase or a word that I grew up listening to. So once I got to college and I started hearing it more, I thought of it as sort of tacky or I guess impersonal. It didn't seem very what's the word that I'm looking for? It didn't feel very authentic. But over time, I've sort of learned that it's really important for my career in the future. But I also realized that even though I call it networking, there's also so many different forms of networking, and like it's sort of about finding like your own style to it.
I really like that point of view because I kind of had the same impression. Networking is not something that I grew up around. And I think when I did enter college, I kind of thought that was something business majors do. And along with that, I had kind of attached the negative connotations that you're only doing it in a self-serving way. But I like that your perception of it is more about like building that network in a genuine way, that you're talking to people not only about how they got where they are, but genuinely as a person, and not necessarily doing it to get something out of that. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah, because one more thing I'll have to share. Sorry to interrupt.
No, you're fine.
Over the summer, I've also gained like so many mentors because of networking, and it's because of that reason, not looking for a job or being very direct and self-serving. But if you look for the relationship, they'll want to help you over time and sort of guide you through the process. I just felt like I should share that.
No, thank you. I think that's really important, is not only establishing those relationships, but keeping them going, either setting reminders to check in if you're a forgetful person, or maybe remembering like an important date for them or anything like that. Or if you see an article and you think of them, I think those are really important things to kind of just work into our habits. So before I ask our kind of tying up and closing question, I just wanted to ask you if there's anything else that we haven't asked yet that you think is important to your identity as a first-gen student in Batten.
Batten has really made me like think critically about my identity, especially like being Latino, being part of the Latinx community, and also being FGLI, because I think even though those are both parts of my identity, one, you have to like, I think with FGLI you really have to like self-identify yourself, and it's something where like you have to reveal that, because I mean, we could be having this conversation and I may not know if you're, FGLI. Same with so many other people. And I think strategically for the Batten School, I think that's something that the Batten School has to think about, because I think community is really important, and you have to figure out how to create that community. So I don't know if there's like ways to like personally reach out to students. I guess sort of like how Professor Martin did. He identified which students were FGLI and wanted to start that conversation with them. And I think once that conversation starts, you start hearing different anecdotes and experiences, and I think that's you can learn so much from those personal experiences.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because I think when I first got to UVA specifically as a first gen, I was aware of that part of my identity, but I kind of tried to hide it because I figured it would be easier for me here if I did hide it. But once I kind of found a community of people that were freely comfortable with self-identifying in that way, I found it actually a lot more empowering. And I think if Batten could make a commitment to continually putting on workshops or listening panels again during First Gen Week, because I think they kind of missed that opportunity this year for whatever reason. I don't think it's for lack of commitment or energy around our community, but I think recognizing the ways in which that is so important for us to see those spaces and see that Batten is not only here to support us, but to celebrate us and the ways in which we add to the Batten community. So with that in mind, how do you envision the future of Batten's first gen community, either in regards to support or some of the community aspects that you've touched on already?
So I guess one, starting off with, I wish that the application fee would just go away, because I think I said it earlier, as long as there's a fee, there's going to be a barrier. Some students may not feel comfortable in asking for the waiver itself, and it may be complicated for them to, make that phone call or even send that email. I think that's could potentially be, I don't know if that's selection or non-selection of who we're getting into our applicant class. In terms of community, so I'm a part of a group called the Batten Latinx Network here within the Batten School, and I founded it like about a year ago exactly, and it was with that sense of community, and I figured that once there's a community established, within the institution, students will feel more comfortable in approaching the space. And I've seen that already with like first and second years who are already interested in the program way before I was.
Yeah.
They're way ahead of me. And I think it starts with people who identify themselves and having that relationship with others who, want to be in a space where others relate to them and have similar perspectives. Because something I think about is that if I'm thinking about a program or a school or a major, I want to be around people who understand my perspective. It's very emotionally draining and mentally draining for you to be the only one who can validate your story in a room. Part of the reason I'm double majoring in anthropology is because there's a lot of sociological and anthropological concepts that may go over people's heads in Batten, just because we talk about just a lot of legislation which is devoid of this language that's absolutely critical to the communities that legislation or policies are going to be held. So I guess going off that, I think also I know Professor Martin's working on restructuring the curriculum, so I think potentially looking for spaces within the curriculum to, I guess, address more of these like sociological or anthropological, or even talking more about identity within the Batten curriculum, I think could be beneficial, because I was also telling someone the other day is like Batten is very quick to say we want to be a leader in institutions where policy is made and legislation is made, but if you look at the makeup of the school, we're exactly the same way as Congress is. Like we look exactly the same. We're similar background, so I don't think until we start changing that narrative we can truly be in line with like the mission and that story that is told here.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point to bring up, is that diversity of backgrounds is so important, and we are kind of devoid of that right now. I know Batten has a commitment to that, but I think by supporting the first-gen community, they are going to be supporting more diverse and attracting more diverse people, and that better policy comes out of that, because when there are voices missing in a room, there are things that I'm not going to consider as from my background that you might, and vice versa. And I think that's really important, that committing to first gens is also committing to diversity. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Anything else?
Yeah, I think it has to be a verbal commitment as well, which is what I think you were leading to, because something I've also heard is like diversity of thought or diversity of opinion. Yeah. But I mean, I think that's not as direct as we need to be. Like we have to be very verbal in saying like we want FGLI students, and we want to be accessible to FGLI students. Additionally to Black students at the university, Latinx students at the university, whoever it may be, they're gonna have diversity of thought, but
that's informed by their identity.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you have people, you're actively looking for people of color in the room, then I mean that tells a completely different story. And of course, there's gonna be diversity of thought. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you for making that distinction, because I think that's really important. So if we don't have any other questions, I think that's it for our interview with Brian about his experience as a first gen in the BA program in Batten and the class of 2020, correct? Awesome. All right. Thank you again. Thank you for listening to this episode in the series.
We want to thank Brian again for coming out and sharing his experience as a BA student at Batten.
I really connected with Brian's experience as both a first gen and low income student in Batten. It's important to acknowledge that while these parts of our identities overlap and inform one another, that our needs as first gens are distinct from those that we have as low-income students. His recommendations that Batten waive the application fee while targeted for low-income students can also help bridge that same barrier for first-gen students as well.
I totally agree. I love how Brian, along with Avery, showed that first-gen students are so proactive in taking advantage of all opportunities to grow and level the playing field between them and their peers. I think any adjustments to be made within the Batten community will be received with open arms by first-gen Batten students and will definitely be taken advantage of to the fullest extent.
Definitely. I think as first gens, we're thankful for any opportunities and support that we get to level the playing field for ourselves. If you have any topics or personal stories that you would like to share with the Batten community, we welcome your voice. Just contact Catalina, Meghan, or Jasmine.
Thanks for listening.